You know, history is full of these absolutely wild butterfly effects, but the one we're looking at today is truly mind-blowing. Welcome to this explainer. We're going to dive right into one of the most incredible yet kind of overlooked chain of events in the ancient world. We're talking about a dramatic historical kidnapping, a moment of profound personal trauma that, believe it or not, fundamentally shaped the origins of early Western political philosophy. It's this crazy story involving tyrants, legendary philosophers, a near-death experience, and how the actual foundations of higher learning were surprisingly laid by a literal hostage crisis.
So keep this number in your head, 20 to 30. Specifically, 20 to 30 minas. Now, in the ancient Greek world, a mina was a unit of currency. And this specific amount, it was the exact price paid at a bustling slave market for a very, very unexpected captive.
Which brings us to a rather strange question. What is the price of Western philosophy? I mean, it sounds like this abstract rhetorical riddle, right? But historically speaking, there's actually a literal answer. It's those 20 to 30 minas. Today, we're going to unravel exactly how this specific sum of ransom money inadvertently birthed an intellectual revolution, a revolution that we're literally still feeling the effects of today.
To get the full picture, here's our agenda for this explainer. We'll start with the price of a philosopher, look at the tyrant's megalopolis, and examine a major clash of ideals. Then we'll get into founding the First Academy, the Liberator of Syracuse, and wrap up with a philosophical lesson plan.
Let's jump right in. Part 1, the price of a philosopher and the enslavement of Plato. Yes, actually, that Plato.
It's almost hard to believe, but one of history's most legendary thinkers was sold into human bondage, and it really illustrates just how incredibly volatile the ancient Mediterranean was. Back in 389 BC, Plato, who was around 40 years old at the time, took a trip to Sicily. He mostly just wanted to check out the active volcano Mount Etna, just sheer curiosity. But by late 389 BC, this innocent little sightseeing trip spiraled completely out of control, and he ended up captured and enslaved on the island of Aegina. Fortunately for him, by early 388 BC, a fellow philosopher named Anniceris of Cyrene recognized him and paid his ransom. Fast forward a year, and Plato is back in Athens founding the Academy. But wait, how does a philosopher looking at a volcano suddenly end up in chains? Well, for that we need to meet the guy running Sicily at the time.
Moving to Part 2, the tyrant's megalopolis, an autocracy in Syracuse. We've got a flashback just a bit to 405 BC to set the stage.
So, the absolute ruler of Syracuse was a man named Dionysius I, and he relied entirely on extreme military engineering and raw, unfiltered power. I mean, he was the ultimate strongman. After seizing absolute control in 405 BC, he turned Syracuse into a Greek superpower. It rivaled Sparta and even outgrew Athens in population. He built the Euryalus fortress, which was just this insanely sophisticated military structure for its time. He pioneered these massive quinquereme warships, picture 5 rows of oars, and even invented early artillery, like the belly bow crossbow. He maintained his grip through force, treachery, and literally forcing entire populations to relocate to build up his megalopolis.
Which leads us straight into Part 3, a clash of ideals, or wisdom versus absolute power.
So, during Plato's visit, he gets introduced to the tyrant Dionysius I by the tyrant's own brother-in-law, a guy named Dion. Now, Dion was a huge fan of philosophy. Dionysius? Not so much. Talk about a culture clash. We've got two completely opposed worldviews here. You've got Plato, right, championing virtue, justice, and this whole concept of the philosopher king, a ruler guided purely by wisdom. And sitting across from him is Dionysius I, who relies solely on military might and demands absolute, unquestioning deference. So what does Plato do? He tries to lecture the tyrant. He literally argues that the life of a tyrant is inherently miserable. As you can guess, Dionysius, who was absolutely not used to being spoken to like this, was incredibly offended.
And that class turned into a life-or-death crisis really quickly. Dionysius banishes Plato and secretly instructs a Spartan ship captain to either kill him or sell him into slavery. Look at this journey across the Mediterranean. The captain takes Plato from the absolute autocracy of Syracuse and dumps him in Aegina. The problem? Aegina was a highly hostile war zone at the time, locked in a bitter conflict with Athens. Any Athenian who landed there was automatically executed or enslaved, no questions asked. So Plato is thrown into a brutal slave market. But in a massive stroke of luck, that philosopher from Cyrene we mentioned earlier, Anniceris, happened to be there, recognized Plato, and handed over those 20 to 30 minas to rescue him.
Let's look at Part 4, founding the First Academy.
Here's where a moment of severe trauma turns into a lasting educational legacy.
The narrative shifts back to Athens, and this is the real twist of the story. What happened to that ransom money? Once Plato was safely home, his friends and supporters all chipped in and gathered 20 to 30 minas to repay Anniceris for saving his life. But Anniceris completely refused to take the money back. So now they have all these funds collected, and they don't need them to buy Plato's freedom anymore. So what did they do? They repurposed it. That exact ransom money was used to buy a plot of land for Plato to teach on.
And that specific plot of land became the Academy. Founded around 387 BC, it's widely considered the very first institution of higher learning in the Western world. It is such an incredible historical paradox when you stop and think about it. From the cruel, petty whims of an absolute tyrant and the terrifying slave markets of a war zone, the physical and financial foundation of Western academia was born. It really proves how deeply enduring academic institutions can emerge from periods of intense political instability.
Moving to Part 5, the Liberator of Syracuse and the Fall of the Tyranny. We need to pivot back to Sicily to see what happened to Dionysius's autocratic model.
Because, as we see throughout history, tyranny usually fractures into utter chaos once the founder is gone. When Dionysius I died in 367 BC, his son, Dionysius II, inherited the empire, but he completely lacked his dad's ruthless military brilliance. Syracuse just fell apart into a decade of civil war and anarchy. Dionysius II did manage to reclaim the city around 346 BC, but it was broken and depopulated. Petty despots were popping up everywhere, and a massive Carthaginian invasion was looming. In desperation, Syracusan exiles reached out to their mother city, Corinth. Now, Corinth was rooted in democratic ideals, not autocracy, and they actually answered the call. They sent a general named Timoleon over with a ridiculously tiny force, just 700 to 1,000 mercenaries.
And you have to look at the stark contrast between the two men who defined Syracuse's destiny. Dionysius I was the ultimate autocrat. He conquered with force, built his power on treachery, and held onto it until his dying breath. But Timoleon? He was a democratic liberator, outnumbered and outgunned. He used brilliant tactics to defeat Dionysius II, crush the Carthaginians, depose the local despots, and actually restore democratic institutions. And the best part? After doing all that, he voluntarily retired. He just stepped down. He never seized power for himself. He proved that effective leadership doesn't have to rely on absolute dominating control.
Let's wrap things up with Part 6, a philosophical lesson plan, to really see the legacy of this whole conflict.
You can practically see Plato processing his own trauma step by step to forge early Western political philosophy. Step 1. He directly witnessed the corruption of absolute tyranny in Syracuse and literally almost died because of it. Step 2. Using the exact funds meant for his physical freedom, he built the independent academy as a safe haven to cultivate intellectual thought. Step 3. He channeled everything he learned into writing his masterwork, The Republic. He wasn't just complaining about bad rulers, he was actively designing a blueprint for the ideal, just philosopher king, someone the exact opposite of Dionysius I.
The ancient sources tell us that when Dionysius ordered Plato to be sold, he actually justified it with a cruel joke. He supposedly said, since Plato was a just man, he would still be happy even as a slave. It's just such a chilling, arrogant historical detail. But wow, talk about the supreme irony. That tyrant's cruel joke inadvertently paid for the very institution that would spend centuries teaching the world how to recognize and dismantle tyranny. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to end on. If the very first Western academic institution was forged as a direct response to, and literally an escape from, absolute autocratic power, well, do our modern institutions still act as a necessary bulwark against the threat of tyranny today? Do the lessons we learned from Plato, Dionysius, and Timoleon still apply to our own political structures right now? It is definitely a fascinating question to ponder the next time you look at the institutions around us. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.